Welcome to Verified Fears. There are stretches of American highway where truckers drive for hours without seeing another soul, where the darkness swallows everything beyond the headlights, and where the isolation can play tricks on your mind. Tonight, we're bringing you 11 encounters from the men and women who haul freight across the loneliest roads in this country, each one more disturbing than the last. Dim the lights, and let's begin. Mike Garrison had been driving trucks for 28 years, and he thought he'd seen everything Route 50 had to offer. The Nevada stretch, that infamous slash of asphalt they called the loneliest road in America, had become as familiar to him as his own face in the mirror, though lately he'd been avoiding looking at both. 3 months after the divorce papers were finalized, he found himself taking longer routes, volunteering for the runs nobody else wanted. Anything to keep from going back to that empty apartment in Reno. Tonight he was running empty after dropping a load in Ely, the kind of deadhead run that kills your profit margin. But Mike didn't care about profit anymore. He just needed to keep moving. It was pushing 3 a.m. when he rolled past Austin. The darkness beyond his headlights so complete, it felt like driving through outer space. The summer heat was still brutal even at this hour, the kind of oppressive warmth that made the air shimmer and dance above the asphalt, turning distant tail lights into floating red phantoms. His CB radio crackled with static, the occasional trucker checking in from somewhere far down the line, voices disconnected and lonely. Mike hadn't slept properly in 36 hours, riding on coffee and gas station energy drinks, his eyes burning as he watched the mile markers crawl past. That's when he saw the figure at the rest stop just past Cold Spring Station, standing under the single working light like an actor on a stage, thumb out in the universal gesture. Mike almost drove past. He'd learned long ago that picking up hitchhikers was asking for trouble, but something made him hit the brakes. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was guilt about all the times he'd ignored people who needed help. Or maybe it was just that the figure looked so completely out of place in the middle of nowhere that Mike's curiosity got the better of him. The man who climbed into the cab was maybe 40, wearing a faded trucking company uniform that Mike didn't recognize, his face sunburned and streaked with what looked like road dust. "Thanks for stopping," the man said, his voice rough like he hadn't spoken in hours. "Rig broke down about 10 miles back. Transmission just gave out." Mike nodded, pulling back onto the highway. "You call for a tow?" The man laughed, a strange hollow sound. "No signal out here. You know how it is." They drove in silence for a while, the stranger staring out at the darkness with an intensity that made Mike uncomfortable. "What company you with?" Mike asked, trying to make conversation. The man gestured vaguely at his shirt, but Mike couldn't make out the logo in the dim light. "You wouldn't know it. Small outfit." Then the stranger did something that made Mike's skin prickle. "You should take the next left," he said. "There's a priority pickup waiting." Mike frowned. "I'm running empty back to Reno. I don't have any pickups scheduled." The man smiled, and there was something off about it, something that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, you do? They just called it in. Check your phone." Against his better judgment, Mike grabbed his phone from the cup holder. No signal, just like the stranger said. But there was a text message sitting there with no sender information, just coordinates and the words, "Priority load, Cold Springs Junction." "How did you know about this?" Mike asked, his heart starting to beat faster. "Take the left," the stranger repeated. "It's important." Mike's hands tightened on the wheel. Every instinct told him to keep driving straight, to drop this guy off at the next town and forget this whole thing. but his curiosity was overwhelming. And there was something else, something he couldn't quite name, a compulsion that made his hands turn the wheel almost against his will. The left turn took them off Route 50 onto a narrow dirt road that Mike had never noticed before, despite having run this route hundreds of times. The road wasn't on his GPS, which showed them still traveling on the main highway, even as they bounced over increasingly rough terrain. "Where exactly are we going?" Mike demanded. The stranger turned to look at him, and in the glow of the dashboard lights, his eyes seemed wrong somehow. Too dark, too deep. "You know where we're going, Mike?" Mike's blood went cold. "I never told you my name." The stranger smiled again. "You didn't have to. You know, she tried to hold it together. Your wife. She really did. But you were never there, were you? Always on the road, always running from something." Mike's hands were shaking now. "How do you know about my wife?" "Take another left at the next clearing." Mike wanted to stop, wanted to turn around, but his hands kept steering where the stranger indicated. The landscape had changed, becoming increasingly alien. The scrub brush and desert giving way to something else. Something that didn't belong in Nevada. The temperature gauge showed it was still over 100 degrees outside, but Mike could see his breath forming clouds in the cab. "You remember that night 10 years ago?" the stranger asked conversationally. "The night you fell asleep at the wheel just for a second? You never told anyone about that, did you? About the car you sideswiped in the dark, how you just kept driving?" Mike's heart was hammering against his ribs. He had never told anyone about that night, had convinced himself over the years that it hadn't really happened, that he'd dreamed it. "I don't know what you're talking about," he whispered. "Sure you do. This is the place, Mike. Pull over." They'd arrived at what looked like an old way station, long abandoned. The building half collapsed and covered in graffiti. And sitting in the parking lot, lit by Mike's headlights, was a truck. His truck. Same company, same number, same everything. Except it was rusted and dead. Weeds growing through the wheel wells, the windshield shattered. The registration sticker on the door showed a date from 15 years ago. "What is this?" Mike's voice cracked. He turned to look at the stranger, but the passenger seat was empty. The door hadn't opened, no sound had been made. The man had simply vanished like smoke. Mike sat frozen, unable to move, unable to process what he was seeing. With trembling hands, he opened his door and stepped out into the desert night. The air felt wrong, thick and syrupy, like moving through water. He approached the abandoned truck slowly, terrified of what he might find. The driver's side door was unlocked. Inside, the cab was exactly like his. Down to the coffee stain on the passenger seat, the picture of his ex-wife that he'd kept on the dashboard before she left. And there, hanging from the rearview mirror, was his wedding ring, the one he'd lost 3 years ago after the worst fight he and his wife ever had, the one he'd claimed slipped off while he was working on the engine. He reached out to touch it, and the world lurched. Mike opened his eyes to find himself back at the Cold Springs rest stop, his truck idling in the parking space, no passenger, no stranger. The clock on his dashboard showed that 3 hours had passed, but he had no memory of them. His logbook was open on the seat beside him, and someone had written in it, not in his handwriting, "You can't run from yourself forever." He looked down at his left hand. The wedding ring was back on his finger, cold against his skin, even though he distinctly remembered leaving it in a drawer in his apartment. His phone buzzed. A text from his ex-wife, the first communication they'd had in months. "I know you've been avoiding this, but we need to talk. There are things I never told you. Things about that night. Mike's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he put the truck in gear and pulled back onto Route 50. In his rearview mirror, he could see the rest stop shrinking behind him. And for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, he saw the figure standing there again under the light, watching him go. The strangest part, the part that would keep Mike awake for weeks afterward, wasn't the phantom truck or the missing time or even the wedding ring. It was the growing certainty, the absolute bone-deep knowledge that he'd been here before, had picked up this same hitchhiker, had made this same drive into the desert. Not once, but many times. Caught in a loop he couldn't remember until it was too late. And as the sun began to rise over the loneliest road in America, Mike realized with creeping horror that he couldn't remember where he was supposed to be going. Couldn't remember dropping off a load in Ely. Couldn't remember anything before stopping at that rest stop. He looked at the wedding ring on his finger, and in the growing light, he could see an inscription on the inside that definitely hadn't been there before. Until you remember. Mike drove on through the dawn, the highway stretching endlessly ahead, wondering if he'd ever really left that rest stop at all, or if he was still sitting there in the dark, waiting for someone to pick him up. The veteran driver had been running long haul for 15 years, and she thought she'd seen everything the road could throw at her until the November day, when she started her first solo run after losing her husband and co-driver to a massive heart attack 3 months earlier. At 38, she'd never driven alone before, had always had him in the passenger seat navigating and keeping her company and sharing the endless miles. And now the cab felt too large and too quiet, filled with an absence that pressed against her like physical weight. She'd taken 3 months off after the funeral, but the bills kept coming and the company had been patient, but eventually they needed her back on the road. So here she was hauling livestock feed from Minnesota to Montana along U.S. Route 2, the northern route that cut through some of the loneliest country in America. The first major snowfall of the season had started that afternoon, what the Weather Service was calling a significant winter storm. And by evening, it had developed into full whiteout conditions that reduced her world to the narrow tunnel of her headlights and the hypnotic swirl of snow against her windshield. She'd been driving for 6 hours, making slow progress through the deteriorating conditions, when she first glimpsed the figure in her passenger seat. It appeared in her side mirror as she was checking her trailer, just a shadow sitting where her husband used to sit. And her first thought was that grief was making her hallucinate, that the stress and loneliness and exhaustion were combining to show her what she wanted to see. She looked directly at the passenger seat and found it empty as expected, just her husband's old travel mug still sitting in the cup holder where she'd left it like a shrine. But when she glanced back at the mirror, the shadow was there again, more distinct this time. Clearly the shape of a person sitting upright and facing forward. She tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, the way shadows and reflections could create illusions in the confined space of a truck cab. But over the next hour, the figure appeared in every reflective surface she looked at, growing clearer and more defined with each sighting. The rearview mirror showed it sitting in the sleeper berth. The chrome on her door handle reflected it, standing right beside her. The window glass caught its silhouette leaning forward from the back of the cab. And each time she looked directly, there was nothing there, just empty space and her own fear making her heart race. The figure was definitely not her husband. She could see that much now, could make out enough details to know this was someone else. Someone wearing clothing that looked old-fashioned in a way she couldn't quite place. Maybe from the 70s or 80s based on the collar and jacket style. The whiteout conditions were getting worse, the wind driving snow horizontally across the highway and making it nearly impossible to see the road. And she made the decision to pull over at the next safe opportunity, to wait out the worst of the storm before continuing. But the figure in her mirrors was getting closer with each sighting, moving forward through the cab in a way that defied the fact that nothing was actually there. She found a wide shoulder and pulled over, her truck sliding slightly on the ice before coming to a stop, and sat with the engine idling and the heater running full blast while she tried to calm her breathing and think rationally about what was happening. The snow was so heavy now that she couldn't see more than a few feet beyond her windows, the world reduced to white static, and in that isolation, the figure became impossible to ignore. It appeared in her phone screen when she tried to check the weather radar, in the glass face of her gauges on the dashboard, in the reflection of her coffee cup. Always the same person, always getting incrementally closer. And she realized with growing terror that she could now see it in multiple reflective surfaces simultaneously, surrounding her like it was closing in from all directions. She tried covering the mirrors with towels and turning off her phone, but the figure appeared in the chrome of her gear shift, in the glossy surface of her logbook cover, in the window glass that she couldn't cover without losing all visibility. And she understood that it would find any surface that could hold a reflection, that there was no way to hide from something that existed only in mirrors. The CB radio was dead, just static and the occasional burst of interference that might have been voices or might have been the storm playing tricks with the signal. And her phone showed no service despite having had a weak signal just minutes before. She was completely isolated, trapped in a metal box during a blizzard with something that was getting closer every time she looked away and looked back. And her mind raced through possibilities, trying to explain what this could be. Grief hallucination seemed most likely, her brain conjuring visions because she missed her husband and couldn't accept that she was truly alone. But the figure looked too consistent, too detailed, too different from her husband to be a manifestation of missing him. She'd heard stories from other drivers about ghosts on the highways, about hitchhikers who vanished, and mysterious figures that appeared in storms. But she'd always dismissed those as campfire tales and urban legends, things that happened to other people but never to rational, experienced drivers like herself. The figure was close enough now that she could make out facial features in the reflections, could see that it was a man, probably in his 40s, with weathered skin and tired eyes. And there was something about his expression that wasn't threatening, but rather sad, almost pleading, like he was trying to communicate something he couldn't say aloud. She forced herself to study his reflection in her rearview mirror, to really look at him instead of jerking away in fear. And that's when she noticed the details of his clothing, the specific style of trucker jacket with a company logo she didn't recognize, the way his shirt collar was frayed, the old-fashioned CB radio microphone clipped to his shoulder. Her rational mind started working through the puzzle, started asking questions about who this person might be and why he was appearing to her. And on impulse, she grabbed her phone and searched for truck driver deaths on this highway, looking for accidents or incidents that might explain a ghost or a haunting. The search results loaded slowly on her weak signal, and what she found made her skin crawl with recognition and understanding. In 1983, a trucker had been killed on this exact stretch of US Route 2 during a November snowstorm, hit by a driver who didn't stop, whose vehicle was never identified despite an investigation that stretched for months. The victim's name was listed in the old news article, and beneath it was a grainy photograph of the man. And she recognized him instantly as the figure she'd been seeing in her mirrors. The article mentioned that he'd been driving a truck with the same company she worked for, though the company had changed names and ownership several times in the intervening decades, and his rig number was in the same sequence as hers, differing by only a few digits. The hit and run had happened during a whiteout similar to what she was experiencing now, and the driver had been found by a state trooper the next morning. But by then, it was too late. He'd died from his injuries and the cold while waiting for help that never came. She looked up from her phone, and the figure was right there in her rearview mirror, close enough that she could see the frost on his jacket and the snow in his hair, and she realized he wasn't trying to scare her, but was looking for something. Searching for the vehicle that had hit him or the driver who'd never stopped, or maybe just acknowledgement that what happened to him mattered. She spoke aloud then, feeling foolish but also desperate, telling the reflection that she saw him, that she knew what had happened, that she was sorry no one had stopped to help him. The figure's expression changed, became less anguished and more peaceful, and she found herself talking more, describing how she'd found the article, confirming the details of the accident, acknowledging his death in a way that maybe no one else had since the case went cold. She told him about her husband, too, about how she understood what it meant to be left alone on the road, to have your journey end before you were ready. And as she spoke, the figure started to fade, becoming transparent, and then vanishing entirely from her mirrors. The storm began to clear almost immediately, the wind dropping and the snow tapering off, and she sat in the sudden quiet trying to process what had just happened. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text, the signal restored, and when she looked at it, she found a message from an unknown number with just 2 words and no other context. "Thank you." She tried to reply, but the message wouldn't send, showing an error that the number didn't exist, and when she checked her phone's history, there was no record of the incoming text, like it had never happened. She continued her route to Montana, making the delivery on time despite the delay from the storm. And it was only when she returned home and went through her husband's belongings, still packed in boxes she hadn't been able to face, that she found something that made everything even stranger. Tucked in with his old trucking company memorabilia was a newspaper clipping about the 1983 hit and run, yellowed and fragile. And on the back, in her husband's handwriting, was a note that read, "If anything happens to me and you're driving alone, this is who'll watch over you." She never told anyone the full story of what happened that night, knowing it sounded insane, knowing people would dismiss it as grief or hallucination, or the product of a tired mind under stress. But she kept researching the 1983 case, digging through old files and newspaper archives, and discovered that the victim's family had spent years trying to get justice, trying to find the driver who'd left him to die in the snow. And they'd eventually given up and moved away, leaving no memorial or marker to show that he'd existed or that his death had mattered to anyone. She drove back to US Route 2 during the summer, found the approximate location where the accident had happened based on the old police report, and installed a small memorial marker there with his name and dates. A simple acknowledgement that someone remembered. She never saw the figure in her mirrors again after that. Never experienced another supernatural occurrence during her years of driving. But she kept a photograph of the memorial on her dashboard next to her husband's travel mug. A reminder that the highways carry more than just cargo and living drivers. That sometimes the dead are still traveling too. Still looking for someone to acknowledge that they were here and that what happened to them wasn't right. The strangest part, the detail that she thinks about late at night when sleep won't come, is that her husband had that newspaper clipping for years before his death, had written that note about someone watching over her, like he'd known something she didn't. Like he'd encountered the same ghost on the same highway and understood what it meant. She'll never know if her husband had seen the figure too, if he'd made some kind of arrangement or promise that led to that night's encounter. But she likes to think that maybe the dead can help each other, that maybe her husband had asked this lonely ghost to keep an eye on her when he couldn't anymore. and that what she'd experienced wasn't a haunting but a kind of protection. Two lost souls making sure she didn't end up alone on a dark highway during a storm. She still drives Route 2, still makes that run several times a year, and sometimes when the weather turns bad and the isolation feels overwhelming, she glances at her mirrors and sees nothing. But she feels watched in a way that isn't frightening anymore. Feels accompanied by presences she can't see but knows are there, keeping vigil over the loneliest road in their own way. The former paramedic had made the career switch to trucking 3 years ago after burning out completely, after seeing too many things that couldn't be unseen and losing too many patients he couldn't save. The open road had seemed like a chance to escape all that, to haul medical supplies across the country without having to watch anyone suffer, without having to make life or death decisions in the back of a screaming ambulance. He'd chosen this profession specifically because it was solitary, predictable, and safe. Or at least, that's what he told himself when he walked away from emergency medicine and enrolled in CDL school. Tonight he was running I-80 through Wyoming, that desolate stretch between Rawlins and Rock Springs, where civilization seemed to disappear into endless sagebrush and dust. Hauling a load of medical equipment that ironically reminded him of everything he'd left behind. It was September, and dusk was settling over the landscape in shades of orange and brown. A dust storm rolling in from the west and turning the sky into something apocalyptic and strange. He pulled into a rest stop that looked half buried by years of drifting sand, one of those ancient facilities from the 70s that the state had clearly stopped maintaining decades ago, but never bothered to officially close. The building squatted low against the desert, its concrete walls stained and weathered, and only a handful of vehicles dotted the parking lot despite the approaching storm making it foolish to keep driving. His medical training had made him hyper-observant of details, a habit he'd never been able to shake. And as he walked toward the bathroom building, he noticed things that seemed off in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The walls of the building appeared to expand slightly and then contract, a subtle movement that he initially dismissed as wind pressure. Except there was no wind inside the covered walkway leading to the entrance. He pushed through the door and found himself in a dimly lit bathroom that smelled of industrial cleaner and something else, something organic and unpleasant that reminded him of hospital corridors. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting everything in that sickly green-white glow he associated with emergency rooms at 3 a.m., and he noticed that the other people in the rest stop moved with a strange lethargy, their actions slow and dreamlike, as if they were walking through water. An older man stood at the sink, washing his hands over and over, the water running continuously, his eyes unfocused and distant. A woman sat on the bench in the hallway, staring at nothing, her purse clutched to her chest and her breathing slow and rhythmic. He tried to make eye contact with them, to offer a nod of acknowledgement, but they looked through him as if he wasn't there, as if they were trapped in some private world he couldn't access. The bathroom stall door wouldn't stay latched, swinging open slowly whenever he tried to close it, and the walls felt warm to his touch when he braced himself. Warmer than they should be given the temperature outside, almost like touching living skin. He heard a sound beneath the hum of the ventilation system. A rhythmic noise that his medical training immediately recognized as similar to breathing, that wet, inhale-exhale pattern of lungs working. Except it was too deep, too slow, coming from the walls themselves. His rational mind tried to explain it away as pipes or ventilation, but his instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this place, that he needed to leave immediately. He rushed back outside to the parking lot, and that's when he noticed the dust covering the other vehicles. Wasn't just from the approaching storm, but from days or weeks of accumulation. thick layers that suggested these cars and trucks had been sitting here far longer than any reasonable rest stop visit would require. He approached a sedan with dust so thick someone had written, "Wash me" in it. Except the dust beneath the writing was already starting to fill back in, and when he peered through the window, he saw personal belongings scattered inside, a child's toy, a woman's jacket, things people wouldn't normally leave behind. The other travelers he'd seen inside started emerging from the building, moving with that same strange slowness, and he called out to them asking if they needed help, if they were okay. But they didn't respond, just drifted toward their vehicles without any sign they'd heard him. One man, wearing a trucker's vest and carrying a coffee cup, walked directly to an 18-wheeler with flat tires and dead batteries and climbed into the cab as if planning to drive away. He followed the man, knocked on the truck door, and asked how long he'd been here. And the man looked at him with eyes that were bloodshot and exhausted and said, "Just stopped for a quick break, just need to rest a bit before I get back on the road." But the inspection sticker on his windshield was 3 years expired, and the registration tag showed a date from 4 years ago. The driver's logbook, visible on the dashboard, was filled with entries all from the same week in 2019. The same dates repeated over and over in increasingly shaky handwriting, as if he'd been living the same few days on an endless loop. He backed away from the truck, his heart pounding now with the kind of adrenaline surge he remembered from emergency calls, and decided to inspect the rest stop building from the outside, walking its perimeter with the trained eye of someone who'd learned to assess situations quickly and accurately. The building's dimensions didn't make sense. The interior space he'd walked through had been much larger than the exterior structure could possibly contain, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse slightly. That same breathing rhythm he'd heard inside, now visible in the subtle expansion and contraction of the concrete. He pressed his hand against the exterior wall and felt warmth, felt that unmistakable sensation of a pulse beneath his palm. The kind of rhythmic throbbing he'd spent years monitoring in patients' wrists and necks. His medical mind tried to rationalize what he was feeling, tried to explain it as vibrations from machinery or thermal expansion. But he knew the difference between mechanical movement and something organic, something alive. He pulled out his phone and started photographing everything, documenting the dust-covered vehicles, the expired registrations, the building's impossible dimensions, working on pure professional instinct to gather evidence of what he was witnessing. Through the windows of the rest stop, he could see more people inside than he'd initially noticed. Dozens of them sitting in the common area or wandering the hallways, all moving with that same drugged slowness. And he realized, with creeping horror, that they might have been here for months or years, trapped in some kind of stasis they couldn't recognize or escape. He tried the main entrance again, determined to warn them, to get them out, but found the door harder to open than it should be, as if the building itself was resisting his entry. And when he finally forced his way inside, the air felt thick and syrupy, like moving through something viscous and alive. The people inside turned to look at him, and their expressions were blank, empty, as if whatever made them individuals had been slowly drained away. And one woman reached out to him with a pleading gesture, her mouth forming words he couldn't hear over the sound of that deep, rhythmic breathing that now seemed to fill the entire structure. He grabbed her arm, tried to pull her toward the exit, and felt an immediate resistance, not from her, but from the air itself, from the building, as if invisible hands were holding her in place. The floor beneath his feet felt warm and slightly soft. And when he looked down, he saw that the tile patterns seemed to be moving, shifting in subtle ways that suggested the surface was no longer entirely solid. His medical training had prepared him for a lot of things, had taught him to stay calm in crisis situations, to think clearly when others panicked. And that training kicked in now as he realized that whatever this building was, whatever it had become, it was somehow feeding on the people inside, keeping them docile and complacent while it slowly consumed them. He released the woman and ran for the exit, fighting against that invisible resistance, his legs feeling heavy and uncoordinated, like he was running through water or thick mud. And when he finally burst through the door into the parking lot, he fell to his knees, gasping for air that suddenly felt thin and insufficient. He crawled to his truck on his hands and knees, unable to stand, his entire body feeling weak and drained, like he'd been running for hours. And when he finally hauled himself into the cab and started the engine, he looked back at the rest stop and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The windows of the building, the dark rectangular openings that dotted the concrete walls, were arranged in a pattern that suddenly resolved into a face. A massive face with windows for eyes and the entrance as a gaping mouth. And he understood in that moment that the building wasn't just housing something alive, it was alive itself. Had somehow merged with whatever lay beneath it to become a single organism that lured in travelers and fed on them slowly, keeping them alive and compliant for as long as possible. He drove away with his tires spinning in the loose gravel, not bothering with seatbelts or mirrors, just focusing on putting distance between himself and that place. And when he was 5 miles down the highway, he finally pulled over and called 911 to report what he'd found. The dispatcher was polite, but skeptical, taking his information and promising to send someone to investigate. And when state troopers arrived at the rest stop 2 hours later, they found a completely normal facility with a few travelers taking legitimate breaks, no unusual vehicles, no trapped people, nothing to support his claims. He drove back during daylight 2 days later with another truck driver as a witness, determined to prove what he'd seen, and found the rest stop looking exactly as the troopers had described, clean and maintained and perfectly ordinary. The parking lot empty except for one RV and a family eating sandwiches at a picnic table. Every photograph he'd taken on his phone showed nothing but white glare, overexposed images that revealed none of the details he remembered capturing, as if something had reached through the digital files and erased the evidence. The only proof he had left was the sudden weight loss, the 12 pounds he'd somehow dropped during that single visit, as if the building had drained something essential from him during those brief minutes inside, and the exhaustion that plagued him for weeks afterward, a bone-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep could cure. He still drives I-80, still passes that rest stop every few weeks, and he's learned to recognize it by the peculiar way the light falls on the building, by the strange warmth that radiates from it even on cold days. And he never stops there no matter how urgent his need or how bad the weather gets. And sometimes, late at night when he's fighting fatigue on some empty stretch of highway, he'll see other rest stops that give him that same feeling of wrongness, that same sense that the building is watching him, breathing in rhythm with his own lungs, waiting patiently for him to make the mistake of going inside. The rookie driver had only been running solo for 3 months when he took the overnight haul through New Mexico, a route his dispatcher assured him was straightforward and easy, perfect for building up his confidence and hours. At 29 years old, he was one of the youngest long-haul drivers in his company's fleet, still nervous about proving himself worthy of the trust they'd placed in him, still double-checking his load secures and tire pressures obsessively before every departure. Tonight, he was carrying auto parts from Albuquerque to Carlsbad, a simple enough run that would get him back before the weekend if he made good time. And the October night was clear and perfect, the kind of visibility that made the New Mexico desert feel infinite under a sky absolutely packed with stars. Route 285 stretched out before him like a ribbon of black glass, and he'd been making excellent time, actually enjoying the solitude and the rhythm of the road, when something impossible began to happen at mile marker 117. He passed the green reflective sign at 2:14 a.m. according to his dashboard clock, noting it automatically the way new drivers do, trying to build that mental map of highways that veterans seem to carry effortlessly in their heads. The mile marker was positioned near a slight curve where the highway dipped through a shallow valley. Nothing remarkable or memorable about it. Just another point on a road he'd never driven before tonight. He continued for what his speedometer and clock indicated was about 10 minutes of steady driving at 65 miles per hour, which should have put him around mile marker 127 or 128. But when the next mile marker appeared in his headlights, it read 117, the exact same marker he'd just passed. His first thought was that he'd misread the number the first time, that fatigue was playing tricks on his eyes, despite feeling alert and focused, so he made a mental note to pay closer attention and continued driving. The highway ahead looked exactly as it had before. The same gentle curves, the same scattered creosote bushes, the same overwhelming emptiness. And when his clock showed 2:26 a.m. and he'd driven for another calculated 10 minutes, the green sign that appeared read mile marker 117 again. This time there was no mistaking it, no possibility of misreading, and a cold feeling started spreading through his chest as he checked his GPS, which showed him traveling steadily southeast along Route 285. The blue line of his route progressing normally across the screen. He reached for his CB radio to ask if anyone else was experiencing anything strange, but got only static, which wasn't unusual on this empty stretch of highway at this hour. The dashboard clock now showed 2:36 a.m., and he'd been driving for 22 minutes since first passing mile marker 117, which meant he should be approaching mile marker 140. But he already knew with sick certainty what he was going to see when the next marker appeared. Mile marker 117 slid past his window again, and this time he slowed to a crawl, studying every detail of the landscape around it, looking for some explanation, some rational reason why he kept returning to this exact point. The marker itself looked completely ordinary. Standard issue highway department, no damage or graffiti, positioned next to a pile of rocks that might have been a collapsed fence post. He memorized the rocks, the specific pattern of scattered debris, the angle of a dead yucca plant leaning against a boulder. 10 minutes later, he passed the exact same rocks, the exact same dead yucca, the exact same mile marker 117, and the pattern of the debris was identical down to the smallest detail. His hands started shaking on the wheel, and he fought down the rising panic by focusing on procedure, on the practical steps he'd been taught in training for handling unusual situations. He tried his phone but had no signal, tried the CB again but got only that endless static, tried checking his fuel gauge, which showed he'd used approximately a half tank since leaving Albuquerque, even though he'd only been driving for a few hours. The math didn't work. None of this worked. And he was trapped in some kind of impossible loop that his mind refused to accept, even as the evidence mounted with each repetition. On the fourth pass through mile marker 117, he noticed something new. His coffee cup, which he'd filled at a truck stop and been sipping steadily, was fuller than it had been a few minutes ago, as if time was somehow resetting small details along with his position on the highway. He tried different strategies on subsequent loops, varying his speed, changing lanes, even briefly stopping his truck completely at mile marker 117 to break whatever pattern was holding him. But nothing worked. Each loop took exactly 12 minutes according to his dashboard clock. And at the end of those 12 minutes, mile marker 117 would appear again, no matter what he did. On the seventh loop, something changed in a way that made his blood freeze completely. he saw himself pulled over on the shoulder just past the mile marker, saw his own truck with its distinctive company logo and the small dent in the passenger door that he'd gotten during his very first solo parking attempt. He slowed as he approached, watching his other self standing outside the truck talking to a state trooper whose patrol car was parked behind the 18-wheeler. And he laid on his horn trying to get their attention, trying to warn himself of what was happening. But neither figure reacted to the sound. He passed within feet of his own truck, close enough to see his own face in conversation with the trooper. And neither of them turned to look, as if he and his truck were somehow invisible or existing in a different reality. The next loop was even worse because his pulled-over self was gone. But as he passed through mile marker 117, he saw his own truck approaching from ahead, headlights bright in his eyes, and he swerved to avoid collision. But the other truck passed through his space without impact, like driving through fog or projection. He pulled over then, his heart hammering, and opened his logbook with shaking hands, only to discover 7 different timestamps for mile marker 117, 7 separate entries in his own handwriting documenting 7 different loops through this same location. Except he had no memory of writing most of them. The most recent entry, dated just minutes ago according to the timestamp, read, "Stopped at 117, refused to continue, broke the loop." But he hadn't written that, hadn't stopped, had been driving continuously through each repetition. The dashboard clock showed 3:26 a.m. now, 72 minutes since he'd first passed this marker, which meant he'd completed 6 loops. But his logbook showed 7 entries, which meant somewhere in this nightmare he'd lost track of a complete cycle. 12 minutes that existed in his logbook, but not in his memory. He started the truck again, determined to break free by any means necessary. And on the 8th loop, he made a decision that seemed to come from some instinct deeper than rational thought. Instead of continuing past mile marker 117 or trying to speed through it, he pulled onto the shoulder exactly at the marker, turned off his engine completely, and waited, watching the dashboard clock count down the 12 minutes. At first, nothing happened. Just the usual night sounds of the desert, the tick of cooling metal, the whisper of wind through the cab's ventilation. But as the clock approached the 12-minute mark, the quality of the darkness outside changed, became thicker and more absolute, like the universe was holding its breath. The 12-minute mark came and went, and for the first time since this started, he didn't find himself approaching mile marker 117 again. The clock kept advancing normally, showing 3:38, then 3:39, then 3:40, and the mile marker beside his truck remained mile marker 117, unchanged and unchanging. He sat there for exactly 12 minutes by his watch, refusing to move or start the engine. And when that time had passed, he felt something shift in the air around him. Felt reality snap back into its normal configuration like a rubber band released from tension. He started his truck and continued southeast, and the next mile marker that appeared was 118, then 119, then 120, and the GPS and clock and fuel gauge all seemed to be functioning normally again. He drove the rest of the route in a state of shock, jumping at every mile marker, convinced the loop would start again. But he made it to Carlsbad without further incident just as the sun was rising over the oil fields and scattered towns. At the delivery warehouse, the receiving clerk looked at his paperwork and frowned, asking why his timestamps showed such a huge gap between Albuquerque and Carlsbad for what should have been a 4-hour drive, and he had no answer that wouldn't sound insane. So he mumbled something about road construction and delays, and signed the delivery forms with hands that still hadn't stopped trembling. It was only later, after he'd found a motel and tried to sleep, that he noticed the note tucked into his sun visor, written in his own handwriting on a page torn from his logbook. The message was simple and terrifying. "Don't stop at 117." He had no memory of writing it, couldn't explain how it had gotten there. But the handwriting was unmistakably his own, and the ink looked fresh, like it had been written just hours ago. He pulled out his logbook and found the torn page. Except it wasn't torn from the most recent entries, but from a section dated 3 weeks in the future. Pages he hadn't lived through yet, pages that shouldn't exist. The implications of that made his head spin. Suggested that he'd somehow been experiencing loops within loops, that he might have been trapped at mile marker 117 far longer than he remembered, living through variations of the same 12 minutes again and again, until he finally discovered the solution of stopping and waiting. The worst part came when he checked his phone and found text messages from his dispatcher asking where he was, why he hadn't checked in. Messages that were time-stamped over the course of 3 days, even though he was certain only one night had passed since leaving Albuquerque. His GPS history showed him stationary at mile marker 117 for 72 hours, not 72 minutes. And his fuel tank was nearly empty, even though the gauge had showed half full when he finally broke free. He drove back to Route 285 a week later during daylight, determined to investigate mile marker 117 and understand what had happened to him. But the marker looked completely ordinary. Just a standard green sign in an unremarkable stretch of highway. He talked to other drivers in truck stops and online forums, carefully feeling out whether anyone else had experienced something similar, and discovered that mile marker 117 on Route 285 had a reputation. That drivers who'd been on the road for decades knew to avoid stopping anywhere near it. That there were whispered stories of trucks that had disappeared for hours or days before reappearing with drivers who couldn't explain the missing time. He still drives long-haul routes, still takes overnight runs through remote areas. But now he carries a different kind of awareness. A recognition that the highways cutting through America's empty spaces might harbor things that don't obey the normal rules of time and space. And on his dashboard, laminated and permanently visible, he keeps that note in his own handwriting warning him about mile marker 117. A reminder that some roads can trap you in moments that repeat forever unless you have the courage to stop moving and let time catch up with wherever you've been stranded. He's never driven Route 285 again, refuses every run that would take him through that section of New Mexico. And when other rookie drivers ask him for advice about overnight routes, he always tells them the same thing. If you ever find yourself passing the same mile marker twice, don't panic, don't speed up, and whatever you do, don't try to outrun it because you can't outrun a loop in time. You can only stop and wait for it to release you back into the world that makes sense. The driver had been running long haul for 23 years, building what he told everyone was a clean record and a solid reputation. But the truth was more complicated than his employment file suggested. At 47, he'd managed to reinvent himself after serving 3 years for vehicular manslaughter, a conviction that came from a bar fight that escalated into something deadly when he was 24. Young and stupid and full of rage he didn't know how to control. The court had been lenient because it was technically an accident, because the other man had thrown the first punch, because everyone agreed it was a tragic situation with no real winners. But the driver knew the truth that he'd never spoken aloud. It hadn't been self-defense, not really. And the man who died that night on the wet asphalt behind that Oklahoma dive bar had been trying to walk away when the fatal blow landed. He'd spent 2 decades running from that truth, putting miles and years between himself and the person he'd been, hauling furniture across the country and telling himself he'd paid his debt and deserved the second chance he'd been given. Tonight, he was running I-40 through Oklahoma, that long, straight stretch between Weatherford and Elk City, where the landscape flattened into endless wheat fields and the occasional oil derrick, and a March thunderstorm was building on the horizon, turning the late afternoon sky the color of old bruises. He needed fuel and food, and decided to pull into a truck stop that appeared on the right side of the highway. One of those vintage operations from the 80s that somehow still survived despite the corporate megastops that had taken over most of the industry. The building had that frozen-in-time quality of places that stopped evolving decades ago. All faded paint and flickering neon, and a parking lot that still had the old-style diagonal parking spots instead of the modern pull-through bays. The oppressive humidity made everything feel sticky and wrong as he climbed down from his cab, and he noticed that despite the threatening storm, the air was completely still. Not a breath of wind moving through the tall grass that grew in patches through the cracked parking lot asphalt. The diner attached to the truck stop was nearly empty, just a handful of drivers scattered in booths and a waitress who looked bored behind the counter. And he slid into a booth by the window where he could keep an eye on his truck. The waitress approached with a pot of coffee and a menu, and when she smiled at him, she used a nickname that made his blood run cold, a name that only one person had ever called him, and that person had been dead for 23 years. He tried to tell himself it was coincidence, that it was a common enough nickname that anyone might use it randomly. But the way she said it carried weight and knowledge, like she knew exactly who he was and what that name meant. He ordered without really looking at the menu, his mind racing, and when she walked away, he noticed for the first time that everyone in the diner was watching him with expressions that ranged from curious to knowing to something that looked almost like pity. The man in the next booth leaned over and casually mentioned the intersection of Highway 54 and County Road 1170, rattling off the coordinates like they were discussing the weather. And the driver felt his stomach drop because those were the exact coordinates where the fight had happened, where a man had died because of his fists and his rage and his inability to walk away. He tried to laugh it off, tried to ask how the man knew those numbers, but his voice came out strangled and weak, and the other driver just smiled and went back to his coffee like he'd said nothing unusual at all. The driver looked down at the menu still sitting on his table and saw that the daily special was named after his victim, the full legal name that had been read in court and printed in newspapers. And he knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't coincidence, that something was very wrong with this truck stop and everyone in it. He stood up to leave, but the waitress was already returning with his food, setting down a plate he didn't remember ordering. And when he looked around the diner, he realized that every single table had a newspaper spread out on it. And every newspaper was from the same date 23 years ago, the day after the killing. The headline screaming about the senseless death and the young man arrested at the scene. The papers looked fresh, not yellowed or brittle, like they'd been printed this morning instead of decades ago. And when he picked one up with shaking hands, the ink smudged on his fingers like it was still wet. The bathroom was calling him, offering escape or at least a moment to collect himself. And he stumbled toward it on legs that felt disconnected from his body, pushing through the door and approaching the sink on autopilot. The mirror above the sink showed him as he'd been 23 years ago, 24 years old with longer hair and the kind of hardness in his eyes that came from too much drinking and too little caring. And he spun around expecting to see someone behind him, some trick or projection. But the bathroom was empty, and when he looked back at the mirror, his current 47-year-old face stared back at him like nothing had happened. He splashed water on his face and tried to breathe, tried to think rationally about what was happening. But when he returned to the diner, the other truckers were telling stories in loud voices that carried across the room, and every story was about someone who'd hurt someone else, who'd made a terrible mistake and never paid for it, who carried secrets that weighed them down like cargo they couldn't deliver. One man described hitting a pedestrian and driving away, never reporting it, never stopping to see if the person survived. Another talked about a fight that went too far, about leaving someone injured and alone on a dark road. A woman described a moment of road rage that caused an accident she'd never admitted to causing. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same. And he realized with creeping horror that everyone in this truck stop was here for the same reason, that they'd all done something terrible and gotten away with it. And somehow this place knew their secrets and was forcing them to confront what they'd done. He tried to leave again, walking quickly toward the exit, his keys already in his hand. But when he pushed through the door into the parking lot, his truck wouldn't start, the engine turning over weakly and then dying completely, despite having been running perfectly fine when he'd pulled in. He tried again and again, pumping the gas and checking connections and doing everything his years of experience had taught him. But the truck was dead, as if something had drained all the life from its batteries and electrical system. Other drivers were trying to leave too. He could see them in their cabs, could hear their starters grinding uselessly, and he understood that none of them were going anywhere until this place was finished with them. He walked back inside because there was nowhere else to go, and found that the victim was sitting in his booth now. Not the victim as he'd been at the moment of death, but as he might have looked if he'd lived these 23 years, aged and weathered and wearing an expression that wasn't angry or vengeful, but just infinitely sad. The victim didn't speak at first, just looked at him with those sad eyes, and then asked the question that the driver had been running from for more than 2 decades, the question that haunted his dreams and his quiet moments. The simple question of why. Why hadn't he walked away? Why hadn't he stopped after the first punch? Why hadn't he called for help instead of leaving a dying man in the parking lot? Why had he never admitted to anyone, including himself, that it wasn't self-defense, that it was murder dressed up in legal terminology and circumstantial ambiguity? The driver found himself talking, confessing things he'd never said aloud, telling the truth about that night in ways he'd never allowed himself to think about. And as he spoke, he became aware that everyone in the truck stop was listening, that they were all being given this same opportunity or punishment or whatever this was, a chance to face what they'd done and speak the words they'd buried. He talked until his voice was hoarse, until he'd confessed every detail and every lie, and every moment of cowardice that had defined the last 23 years of his life. And when he finally fell silent, the victim nodded slowly and asked him one more question. What was he going to do now? Knowing that silence and distance hadn't actually freed him from anything. That carrying these secrets had poisoned every mile he'd driven and every relationship he'd tried to build. The driver looked around the truck stop at all these other people trapped in their own confessions, and he understood suddenly that they had a choice, that they could stay here forever in this pocket of frozen time, or they could leave and face the consequences of their actions in the real world. Some of the other drivers were arguing with their victims or their guilt or whatever manifestation this place had conjured for them, insisting they'd done nothing wrong, that circumstances had forced their hands, and he could see that they were fading somehow, becoming less solid and more transparent, as if refusing to acknowledge the truth was causing them to disappear into this place permanently. He stood up from the booth and walked to the payphone by the restrooms, an ancient rotary device that shouldn't have worked but did, and he called the police department in the town where it had happened, where a file with his name still existed in some archive of closed cases. He told the dispatcher that he needed to speak to someone about a cold case from 1992, that he had information about the incident behind the bar on Highway 54, that he was the person who'd been convicted, but there were things about that night that hadn't come out in court, things that changed the nature of what had happened. The dispatcher sounded confused but professional, taking down his information and promising to have a detective call him back. And when he hung up the phone, he felt something shift in the air around him. Felt the weight that had pressed down on his chest for 23 years lift just slightly, enough to let him breathe properly for the first time in decades. His truck started on the first try when he turned the key, the engine roaring to life like it had never been dead. And he pulled out of the parking lot without looking back, driving straight to the nearest state trooper station, where he walked in and asked to speak to someone about reopening a case. The whole process took months, giving depositions and testimony and facing the victim's family, who'd spent over 2 decades believing they knew the whole story. And in the end, the legal consequences were minimal, because the statute of limitations and the original conviction created a complicated situation that prosecutors didn't want to pursue. But the moral consequences were everything. Were the difference between running forever and finally standing still. And when he walked out of the courthouse after his final testimony, he felt lighter than he had since he was 23 years old, and still innocent of the thing that would define his life. He drove back to that stretch of I-40 between Weatherford and Elk City 6 months later, looking for the truck stop, needing to understand what had happened to him there, and whether other drivers were still trapped in that place, making their terrible choices. The truck stop was gone, just an empty lot with old concrete pads showing where fuel pumps had once stood. And when he asked locals about it, they told him that nothing had been there for at least 15 years. That the old truck stop had been torn down in the early 2000s, and the land had sat empty ever since. He has the newspaper from that day, though, the one he'd grabbed from the table, and it's real and solid and definitely printed in 1992, despite being fresh and clean when he took it from a truck stop that apparently didn't exist. He doesn't drive long haul anymore, couldn't go back to that life after everything that happened. But he keeps the newspaper in a frame on his wall as a reminder that some places exist outside of normal geography. Some places remember what we've done and won't let us pass until we remember it too. And some confessions have to be made before the miles can finally carry us towards something that looks like redemption. The veteran driver had been running long haul for 15 years, and she thought she'd seen everything the road could throw at her until the November day, when she started her first solo run after losing her husband and co-driver to a massive heart attack 3 months earlier. At 38, she'd never driven alone before, had always had him in the passenger seat navigating and keeping her company and sharing the endless miles. And now the cab felt too large and too quiet, filled with an absence that pressed against her like physical weight. She'd taken 3 months off after the funeral, but the bills kept coming and the company had been patient, but eventually they needed her back on the road. So here she was hauling livestock feed from Minnesota to Montana along U.S. Route 2, the northern route that cut through some of the loneliest country in America. The first major snowfall of the season had started that afternoon, what the Weather Service was calling a significant winter storm. And by evening, it had developed into full whiteout conditions that reduced her world to the narrow tunnel of her headlights and the hypnotic swirl of snow against her windshield. She'd been driving for 6 hours, making slow progress through the deteriorating conditions, when she first glimpsed the figure in her passenger seat. It appeared in her side mirror as she was checking her trailer, just a shadow sitting where her husband used to sit. And her first thought was that grief was making her hallucinate, that the stress and loneliness and exhaustion were combining to show her what she wanted to see. She looked directly at the passenger seat and found it empty as expected, just her husband's old travel mug still sitting in the cup holder where she'd left it like a shrine. But when she glanced back at the mirror, the shadow was there again, more distinct this time. Clearly the shape of a person sitting upright and facing forward. She tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, the way shadows and reflections could create illusions in the confined space of a truck cab. But over the next hour, the figure appeared in every reflective surface she looked at, growing clearer and more defined with each sighting. The rearview mirror showed it sitting in the sleeper berth. The chrome on her door handle reflected it, standing right beside her. The window glass caught its silhouette, leaning forward from the back of the cab. And each time she looked directly, there was nothing there, just empty space and her own fear making her heart race. The figure was definitely not her husband. She could see that much now, could make out enough details to know this was someone else. Someone wearing clothing that looked old-fashioned in a way she couldn't quite place. Maybe from the 70s or 80s based on the collar and jacket style. The whiteout conditions were getting worse, the wind driving snow horizontally across the highway and making it nearly impossible to see the road. And she made the decision to pull over at the next safe opportunity, to wait out the worst of the storm before continuing. But the figure in her mirrors was getting closer with each sighting, moving forward through the cab in a way that defied the fact that nothing was actually there. She found a wide shoulder and pulled over, her truck sliding slightly on the ice before coming to a stop, and sat with the engine idling and the heater running full blast while she tried to calm her breathing and think rationally about what was happening. The snow was so heavy now that she couldn't see more than a few feet beyond her windows, the world reduced to white static, and in that isolation, the figure became impossible to ignore. It appeared in her phone screen when she tried to check the weather radar, in the glass face of her gauges on the dashboard, in the reflection of her coffee cup. Always the same person, always getting incrementally closer. And she realized with growing terror that she could now see it in multiple reflective surfaces simultaneously, surrounding her like it was closing in from all directions. She tried covering the mirrors with towels and turning off her phone, but the figure appeared in the chrome of her gear shift, in the glossy surface of her logbook cover, in the window glass that she couldn't cover without losing all visibility. And she understood that it would find any surface that could hold a reflection, that there was no way to hide from something that existed only in mirrors. The CB radio was dead. Just static and the occasional burst of interference that might have been voices or might have been the storm playing tricks with the signal. And her phone showed no service despite having had a weak signal just minutes before. She was completely isolated, trapped in a metal box during a blizzard with something that was getting closer every time she looked away and looked back. And her mind raced through possibilities, trying to explain what this could be. Grief hallucination seemed most likely, her brain conjuring visions because she missed her husband and couldn't accept that she was truly alone. But the figure looked too consistent, too detailed, too different from her husband to be a manifestation of missing him. She'd heard stories from other drivers about ghosts on the highways, about hitchhikers who vanished, and mysterious figures that appeared in storms. But she'd always dismissed those as campfire tales and urban legends, things that happened to other people but never to rational, experienced drivers like herself. The figure was close enough now that she could make out facial features in the reflections, could see that it was a man, probably in his 40s, with weathered skin and tired eyes. And there was something about his expression that wasn't threatening, but rather sad, almost pleading, like he was trying to communicate something he couldn't say aloud. She forced herself to study his reflection in her rearview mirror, to really look at him instead of jerking away in fear. And that's when she noticed the details of his clothing, the specific style of trucker jacket with a company logo she didn't recognize, the way his shirt collar was frayed, the old-fashioned CB radio microphone clipped to his shoulder. Her rational mind started working through the puzzle, started asking questions about who this person might be and why he was appearing to her. And on impulse, she grabbed her phone and searched for truck driver deaths on this highway, looking for accidents or incidents that might explain a ghost or a haunting. The search results loaded slowly on her weak signal, and what she found made her skin crawl with recognition and understanding. In 1983, a trucker had been killed on this exact stretch of US Route 2 during a November snowstorm, hit by a driver who didn't stop, whose vehicle was never identified despite an investigation that stretched for months. The victim's name was listed in the old news article, and beneath it was a grainy photograph of the man. And she recognized him instantly as the figure she'd been seeing in her mirrors. The article mentioned that he'd been driving a truck with the same company she worked for, though the company had changed names and ownership several times in the intervening decades, and his rig number was in the same sequence as hers, differing by only a few digits. The hit and run had happened during a whiteout similar to what she was experiencing now, and the driver had been found by a state trooper the next morning. But by then, it was too late. He'd died from his injuries and the cold while waiting for help that never came. She looked up from her phone, and the figure was right there in her rearview mirror, close enough that she could see the frost on his jacket and the snow in his hair, and she realized he wasn't trying to scare her, but was looking for something. Searching for the vehicle that had hit him or the driver who'd never stopped, or maybe just acknowledgement that what happened to him mattered. She spoke aloud then, feeling foolish but also desperate, telling the reflection that she saw him, that she knew what had happened, that she was sorry no one had stopped to help him. The figure's expression changed, became less anguished and more peaceful, and she found herself talking more, describing how she'd found the article, confirming the details of the accident, acknowledging his death in a way that maybe no one else had since the case went cold. She told him about her husband, too, about how she understood what it meant to be left alone on the road, to have your journey end before you were ready. And as she spoke, the figure started to fade, becoming transparent, and then vanishing entirely from her mirrors. The storm began to clear almost immediately, the wind dropping and the snow tapering off, and she sat in the sudden quiet trying to process what had just happened. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text, the signal restored, and when she looked at it, she found a message from an unknown number with just 2 words and no other context. "Thank you." She tried to reply, but the message wouldn't send, showing an error that the number didn't exist, and when she checked her phone's history, there was no record of the incoming text, like it had never happened. She continued her route to Montana, making the delivery on time despite the delay from the storm. And it was only when she returned home and went through her husband's belongings, still packed in boxes she hadn't been able to face, that she found something that made everything even stranger. Tucked in with his old trucking company memorabilia was a newspaper clipping about the 1983 hit and run, yellowed and fragile. And on the back, in her husband's handwriting, was a note that read, "If anything happens to me and you're driving alone, this is who'll watch over you." She never told anyone the full story of what happened that night, knowing it sounded insane, knowing people would dismiss it as grief or hallucination, or the product of a tired mind under stress. But she kept researching the 1983 case, digging through old files and newspaper archives, and discovered that the victim's family had spent years trying to get justice, trying to find the driver who'd left him to die in the snow. And they'd eventually given up and moved away, leaving no memorial or marker to show that he'd existed or that his death had mattered to anyone. She drove back to US Route 2 during the summer, found the approximate location where the accident had happened based on the old police report, and installed a small memorial marker there with his name and dates. A simple acknowledgement that someone remembered. She never saw the figure in her mirrors again after that. Never experienced another supernatural occurrence during her years of driving. but she kept a photograph of the memorial on her dashboard next to her husband's travel mug. A reminder that the highways carry more than just cargo and living drivers, that sometimes the dead are still traveling too, still looking for someone to acknowledge that they were here and that what happened to them wasn't right. The strangest part, the detail that she thinks about late at night when sleep won't come, is that her husband had that newspaper clipping for years before his death, had written that note about someone watching over her, like he'd known something she didn't. Like he'd encountered the same ghost on the same highway and understood what it meant. She'll never know if her husband had seen the figure too, if he'd made some kind of arrangement or promise that led to that night's encounter. But she likes to think that maybe the dead can help each other, that maybe her husband had asked this lonely ghost to keep an eye on her when he couldn't anymore, and that what she'd experienced wasn't a haunting but a kind of protection. Two lost souls making sure she didn't end up alone on a dark highway during a storm. She still drives Route 2, still makes that run several times a year, and sometimes when the weather turns bad and the isolation feels overwhelming, she glances at her mirrors and sees nothing. But she feels watched in a way that isn't frightening anymore. Feels accompanied by presences she can't see but knows are there, keeping vigil over the loneliest road in their own way. The old-school trucker had been driving for 32 years, and he'd watched the profession transform from something analog and human into a digital operation run by satellites and algorithms and screens that tracked every mile and every minute. At 56, he was one of the last holdouts against modern technology, refusing to use GPS navigation or fancy communication systems, relying entirely on CB radio and paper maps the way he'd learned when he first climbed into a truck at age 24. His dispatcher had long since given up trying to get him to adopt the tracking software and digital logbooks that everyone else used, accepting that he'd do things his way until he retired or died, whichever came first. Tonight, he was hauling construction materials from Phoenix to Las Vegas on Route 93 through Arizona. That brutal stretch of desert highway that cut through the Hualapai Reservation and some of the emptiest country in the lower 48. It was July and past midnight, but the residual heat from the day still radiated off the asphalt in waves that made the road shimmer and dance. And an electrical storm was building on the distant horizon, lightning flickering without rain in that peculiar desert way. His CB radio had been quiet for the last hour, which wasn't unusual on this lonely stretch, just the occasional burst of static and the whisper of distant conversations too faint to make out clearly. He was between Wickenburg and Wickiup when the static resolved suddenly into a clear voice, describing something that made him sit up straighter and pay attention. The voice, gravelly and tired, was describing a deer about to cross the road in exactly the spot where the driver's high beams would catch it, giving specific details about the size and the direction it would come from. The driver instinctively scanned the road ahead, and sure enough, exactly 5 seconds after the voice finished speaking, a doe bounded out of the desert and across the highway precisely where and how the voice had predicted. He keyed his mic to ask who was broadcasting and how they'd known about the deer, but got only static in response, like no one was there to hear his question. 10 minutes later, the voice came back, this time describing a piece of tire tread on the road ahead that could cause damage if he hit it, giving him time to swerve around debris that appeared exactly where predicted, exactly when predicted. The voice described the next mile marker before he reached it, described a slight dip in the road that would make his cargo shift, described his own thoughts about needing to refuel soon before he'd consciously registered the thought himself. He tried switching CB channels, but the voice followed him, continuing its running commentary on everything happening around and to him. And when he tried his AM radio instead, the same voice came through between bursts of static, predicting road conditions and hazards with perfect accuracy, always exactly 7 seconds before they occurred. His hands started sweating on the wheel because he'd been driving long enough to know when something was genuinely wrong, when the universe was behaving in ways that violated the basic rules of how things worked. The voice began describing personal memories then. Things he'd never told anyone, quiet moments from his childhood, and failures from his marriage, and regrets from 3 decades of life on the road. It spoke about the time he'd missed his daughter's graduation because he'd prioritized a delivery, about the affair he'd had with a waitress in Tucson that he'd never confessed, about the accident he'd witnessed but never reported because stopping would have meant missing a deadline. Each revelation was delivered in that same tired, gravelly voice, not judgmental but matter-of-fact, like reading from a book that contained his entire life in perfect detail. He tried turning off the radio completely, pulling the plug from the back and cutting power to the unit. But the voice continued anyway, coming from the speakers even though the display was dark and the power was disconnected. And he realized with creeping horror that whatever was happening had nothing to do with the actual radio equipment. The predictions became more urgent then, shifting from observations to warnings about dangerous situations before they materialized. The voice described a tire about to blow on his rear axle, giving him time to pull over and discover that the tire was indeed damaged and would have failed catastrophically if he'd continued. It described a wrong-way driver approaching from ahead, someone drunk or confused, and he slowed down and pulled to the shoulder just as headlights appeared traveling in his lane, the vehicle missing him by inches as it swerved past. The voice was keeping him alive. He understood that now, was warning him about hazards that should have killed him. And the 7-second delay was giving him just enough time to react and avoid disaster. He tried to feel grateful, but instead felt terrified because he didn't know what this was or what it wanted or why it had chosen him. And the voice showed no sign of stopping, continuing its predictions in that steady, unchanging tone. The electrical storm was closer now, the lightning creating constant flickering illumination on the horizon. And the voice began describing his own death. It spoke in clinical detail about a rollover accident that would happen in the next few minutes, describing the way his truck would lose traction on an oil slick he couldn't see, the way the trailer would jackknife and pull him off the road, the way the cab would roll 3 times before coming to rest on its roof, with him trapped inside bleeding and unconscious. The voice counted down from 7, marking the seconds until this death would occur. And he had to make an impossible decision about whether to trust a disembodied voice predicting his own demise or ignore it and hope it was wrong. At 3 seconds, he wrenched the wheel hard right, pulling onto the shoulder with no visible reason. And a pickup truck screamed past in his lane, driving the wrong way at high speed. A drunk driver or someone fleeing something, traveling at least 90 miles per hour directly where his truck would have been. The voice went silent immediately after the near miss, cutting off mid-word like someone had flipped a switch, and every electronic device in his truck died simultaneously. The CB radio, the AM radio, his phone, even the digital displays on his dashboard all went dark at once, their screens blank and lifeless. He coasted to a stop on the shoulder, his truck running on mechanical systems only, and sat in the sudden silence trying to process what had just happened. His heart was hammering, adrenaline making his vision sharp and his hands shake. And he knew with absolute certainty that he should be dead right now, that without the voice's warning, he would have been hit by that wrong-way driver at combined speeds that would have been instantly fatal. He tried to restart the electronics, but they were completely dead, not just powered off, but permanently destroyed. As if something had fried every circuit board in the truck, at the same moment the voice disappeared. He made the delivery to Las Vegas using pure mechanical driving, No radio or phone or GPS, relying entirely on his paper maps and his memory of the route. And at the warehouse, he had a mechanic inspect his electrical system. The mechanic showed him the circuit boards, all of them melted in patterns that made no sense. Damage that should have required intense heat or electrical overload, but showed no signs of fire or short circuits. Just perfect geometric patterns of destruction that the mechanic couldn't explain and had never seen before. The mechanic asked if he'd been hit by lightning, but the driver knew he hadn't. Knew the storm had been miles away. Knew this was connected to the voice somehow, to whatever had been speaking through his radio and predicting his future. He filed a report with his company about the electrical failure, leaving out the parts about the voice and the predictions because he knew how that would sound. And they replaced all the electronics with new equipment and sent him back out on the road. He never heard the voice again after that night, never experienced another prediction or warning. But something changed in him that he couldn't explain or shake. He started hearing a phantom countdown in his head during close calls on the road, hearing 7, 6, 5 in that same gravelly voice whenever he approached danger. And every time he heard it, he acted immediately, changing lanes or slowing down or pulling over. And every time there was a reason, a hazard he would have hit, or a situation that would have turned dangerous. Other drivers started commenting that he had incredible luck, that he seemed to avoid accidents that should have caught him, that he had an almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time. And he never told them about the countdown he heard, about the voice that had burned itself into his nervous system and now lived somewhere in his subconscious, giving him warnings he couldn't ignore. The strangest part, the detail that made him question his own memory and sanity, was that he found dash cam footage from that night when he finally checked the SD card weeks later. The audio was intact despite the electronics being destroyed, and he watched the entire drive in silence from his apartment, watching the road ahead and listening for the voice. It was there on the recording, clear and unmistakable, making every prediction and giving every warning exactly as he remembered. But the voice wasn't coming from his radio at all. It was his own voice, his own gravelly tone speaking through his radio speakers, which meant somehow he'd been predicting his own future, had been warning himself about dangers before they happened, broadcasting from some future version of himself that had already lived through these events. The timestamp on the audio waveform showed the predictions arriving exactly 7 seconds before the events they described. And the file metadata showed it was a continuous recording with no edits or manipulations, which meant either time had bent in some impossible way that night, or he'd tapped into some ability to see forward along his own timeline and communicate with his past self. He retired 6 months later. Couldn't bring himself to keep driving after understanding what had happened. After knowing that for one night on a desert highway, he'd somehow split across time and saved his own life by speaking warnings backward through broken electronics that shouldn't have worked. He donated his CB radio to a trucking museum, that same radio that had broadcast his voice from the future. And sometimes he visits it and stares at the old equipment and wonders if it's still receiving transmissions from other drivers caught in similar loops, still playing host to voices that shouldn't exist. He still hears the countdown during everyday near misses, at crosswalks when cars run red lights, or in parking lots when vehicles back up without looking. Always that same 7, 6, 5 in his own voice, giving him time to step aside or pause or avoid whatever danger was approaching. And sometimes late at night when he can't sleep, he picks up his old CB radio that he kept from that truck, the one the mechanic said was completely dead. And he scans through the channels listening to static. And just once, just for a moment during an electrical storm similar to that July night, he heard his own voice counting down from 7, warning someone somewhere about something that hasn't happened yet. And he understood that he was still out there somehow, still broadcasting, still trying to save someone from dangers they can't see coming. The young driver had only been hauling long haul for 2 years, and he still carried that arrogant confidence that comes from thinking you know everything after surviving your first few seasons on the road. At 25, he prided himself on cutting corners and finding ways around regulations that he considered bureaucratic nonsense. The kind of attitude that made veteran drivers shake their heads and predict he'd learn his lesson the hard way eventually. He'd developed a reputation for skipping way stations whenever possible, timing his runs to avoid inspections and using back roads that let him bypass the mandatory stops that could eat hours out of his schedule. Tonight, he was running I-10 through West Texas, hauling electronics from El Paso to San Antonio. And the August heat was brutal even at 4 p.m. The sun turning everything into a shimmering mirage and making the asphalt look liquid in the distance. The way station between Van Horn and Sierra Blanca appeared ahead with its mandatory inspection signs lit up, and his first instinct was to look for an exit that would let him avoid it. But the approach was designed to prevent exactly that, funneling all commercial vehicles into the inspection lanes with no legal way to bypass. He pulled in reluctantly, already calculating the time this would waste, and joined the short line of trucks waiting for their turn with the inspectors. The facility looked old and tired, the kind of government operation that had been underfunded for decades, with peeling paint on the walls and equipment that belonged in a museum. The inspector who approached his window looked sunburned beyond any reasonable level, his skin the color and texture of old leather. And there was something disoriented in his eyes that made the driver immediately uncomfortable. The inspector asked for his paperwork and logbook in a voice that sounded scratchy and distant. And when the driver handed them over, the inspector mentioned that he'd need to do a thorough inspection because of some irregularity he'd noticed, though he didn't specify what irregularity or provide any details. The driver protested that his logs were clean and his truck was in perfect condition. But the inspector just smiled vaguely and told him to pull forward into Bay 3 and wait for the inspection to be completed. The waiting area inside the way station building was crowded with other drivers, all of them sitting in various states of boredom and frustration. And the driver settled into a plastic chair and pulled out his phone to kill time. He noticed immediately that he had no service despite having had full bars just minutes ago on the highway. And when he asked another driver how long the inspections typically took at this facility, the man responded that he'd been waiting since this morning, and they hadn't called his name yet. The driver checked the wall clock, which showed 4:47 p.m., and did the mental math, realizing that if this guy had been here since morning, he'd been waiting at least 7 or 8 hours for what should be a 30-minute inspection at most. He looked around the waiting room more carefully and noticed things that didn't make sense, details that his brain had initially skipped over, but now assembled into a pattern of wrongness. The magazines scattered on the tables were from different decades, some from the 90s and some from the 2000s, and a few from just last year, all of them appearing equally fresh and new, despite their varying publication dates. The other drivers in the waiting room seemed lethargic and disconnected, moving slowly and speaking in monotones. And when he tried to strike up conversations with them, their responses were vague and confused about basic details like what day it was or how long they'd actually been waiting. One driver mentioned he'd only stopped for a quick inspection that morning, but when pressed about which morning, he couldn't seem to remember whether it had been today or yesterday or last week. The certainty draining from his face as he realized he genuinely didn't know. The driver started checking vehicle registrations visible through the window, noting the tags on trucks parked in the inspection bays, and his stomach dropped when he saw expired registrations from multiple years ago. Tags that were 2 or 3 or even 5 years out of date, suggesting these trucks had been sitting here far longer than any reasonable inspection would take. He went to the bathroom and found wear patterns that made no sense. Toilets that looked ancient and heavily used despite the facility supposedly being regularly maintained. Graffiti scratched into the walls with dates going back 30 years, and an overall sense of decay that contradicted the exterior appearance of a functioning government facility. He tried to leave then, walking quickly toward the exit, but found himself intercepted by another inspector who politely but firmly told him he couldn't leave until his inspection was complete, that it was regulations, that he needed to wait for his name to be called. The driver argued that he'd been waiting for over 2 hours now, according to his watch, though the wall clock had barely advanced 20 minutes, and the inspector just smiled that same vague smile and guided him back toward the waiting area with a grip that was stronger than it looked. He pulled out his phone again and tried to call his dispatcher, his girlfriend, anyone. But the phone showed no service, despite being a modern device that should work anywhere along this major highway. He tried connecting to the way station's Wi-Fi network that was advertised on a sign, but the network didn't exist when he searched for it. And when he asked the front desk about it, the clerk looked at him with confusion, like he'd asked about something that had never been offered. The other drivers weren't just lethargic, he realized. They were trapped, some of them potentially for years based on the dates in their logbooks that he glimpsed when looking over shoulders. One driver had entries from 2019, the same date repeated over and over in increasingly shaky handwriting, as if he'd been filling out the same day's log for months or years without realizing it. Another had a calendar marked with X's counting down days, but the calendar was from 2016 and had hundreds of X's covering every available space and then continuing onto the walls and table surfaces around where the driver sat. He approached the oldest-looking driver in the room, a man who seemed more aware than the others, and asked directly what was happening here, why everyone seemed to be stuck indefinitely. The old driver looked at him with eyes that held genuine fear and told him about the accident, about the tanker truck that had exploded at this location in 1994, about how everyone in the way station at the time had died instantly in a fireball that had been visible for miles. The driver backed away, shaking his head, because that couldn't be right. He was alive. He was real. He'd driven in here just hours ago from the modern world with modern trucks and modern technology. But the old driver kept talking, explaining that this place existed in some kind of loop now, that it trapped drivers who came through and convinced them they were just waiting for inspections that would never be completed, that the only way out was to refuse to wait, to walk away despite the inspectors and the rules and the consequences. He said most drivers couldn't do it, couldn't bring themselves to violate the regulations even when faced with the reality that this place wasn't real, that they'd stay here forever, telling themselves they just needed to be patient and their turn would come eventually. The driver looked at his own truck registration visible through the window and saw that it now showed an expiration date from 3 years ago, saw that dust had accumulated on his truck in a pattern that suggested months of sitting idle. And he understood that time worked differently in this place, that every minute here was stealing days or weeks from the outside world. He stood up and walked toward the exit, ignoring the inspectors who tried to intercept him, pushing past their grasping hands and protests about regulations and the law. The main door was harder to open than it should have been, requiring real physical force, like he was pushing against resistance that went beyond the mechanical friction of hinges and hydraulics. But he forced it open and stumbled out into the parking lot. Alarms started blaring immediately, loud and insistent, and inspectors were shouting at him to come back, to wait for clearance. But he ran to his truck and climbed into the cab with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The engine started on the first try, despite his truck having supposedly sat for months. And he drove toward the exit gate, which was lowered and blocked. But he didn't slow down, just accelerated and smashed through the wooden arm barrier and out onto the highway. He looked back in his mirrors, expecting to see pursuit vehicles or police or something. But the way station was flickering like a bad television signal, fading in and out of visibility. And then it was simply gone, replaced by empty desert, as if nothing had ever been there. His GPS showed he'd only been stopped for 3 minutes, despite his subjective experience of hours. But his logbook showed a gap of 3 days, with no entries and no explanation for where he'd been or what he'd been doing. His dispatcher called immediately, angry and worried because he'd been unreachable for 72 hours. Because his GPS tracker had shown him stationary at the way station for days because they'd been about to report his truck as stolen or him as missing. He tried to explain what had happened, but it sounded insane even to his own ears. And he eventually gave up and just apologized and promised it wouldn't happen again, knowing they didn't believe him and were probably documenting this incident in his file as evidence of unreliability. He drove back during daylight 3 weeks later with a fellow driver as witness, determined to prove what he'd experienced and document the truth about that way station. They found the location based on his GPS coordinates, found the exact spot where the facility should have been, and discovered only an empty lot with old concrete foundations showing where buildings had once stood, and a historical marker explaining that this had been the site of a major industrial accident in 1994 that had killed 12 people, including several truck drivers who'd been waiting for inspections when a chemical tanker exploded. The marker mentioned that the facility had been demolished shortly after the accident, and the land had remained empty ever since, considered too contaminated for reconstruction. His fellow driver photographed everything, documented the empty lot and the historical marker, and the absence of any functioning way station. But when they reviewed the photos later, several of them showed ghostly outlines of buildings and trucks in the background, transparent and fading, but unmistakably there. He filed an official report with the Trucking Safety Board describing his experience and warning other drivers about the location. But the report was dismissed as either a hoax or a hallucination caused by fatigue and heat exposure. Other drivers, however, started reaching out to him privately after his story circulated on trucking forums and CB radio channels, telling similar stories about the same location, about being trapped in a way station that shouldn't exist and losing hours or days before managing to escape. Some of them had photographs and logbook entries showing impossible durations and time gaps that couldn't be explained. And together, they formed a kind of informal network of drivers who knew the truth about that stretch of I-10 and warned others to avoid stopping there, no matter what the sign said or what the law required. He never skips way stations anymore. Learned his lesson about respecting the systems and regulations that keep drivers safe. But he also learned that some rules apply in places that shouldn't exist, that some facilities are still operating long after they should have closed, and that sometimes the bureaucracy can trap you in ways that have nothing to do with paperwork or inspections and everything to do with being unable to accept that you're caught in something that defies the rational world's rules about time and space and what's possible on a Tuesday afternoon in West Texas. The single mother had been driving trucks for 9 years, taking every high-paying run she could find to support her daughter back home. And when the dispatcher offered her triple the usual rate for a mystery haul with a strict no-questions policy, she didn't hesitate to accept despite every instinct telling her to walk away. At 43, she'd learned that bills didn't pay themselves, and college tuition was only getting more expensive. So she signed the paperwork without reading the fine print, and backed her rig up to a warehouse in Omaha, where men in unmarked uniforms loaded a sealed refrigerated container onto her trailer without speaking to her or making eye contact. The manifest listed the cargo as medical specimens requiring temperature-controlled transport, with delivery instructions to a facility in Lincoln that she'd never heard of and couldn't find listed in any database or map application. The container itself was industrial gray, with no markings except a series of numbers stenciled in black and multiple warning labels about maintaining the cold chain, and absolutely no unauthorized opening under any circumstances. She started the run in mid-December, with temperatures already dropping below zero, the Nebraska landscape frozen and hostile. And she'd been on Route 20 between Valentine and Ainsworth for about 2 hours when she first heard the tapping from inside the trailer. It was faint at first, barely audible over the road noise and the rumble of her diesel engine. But it had a rhythm to it that seemed too deliberate to be cargo shifting or ice forming. A pattern that repeated every few seconds like someone knocking on metal from the inside. She tried to convince herself it was thermal expansion, the container adjusting to temperature changes, or maybe the refrigeration unit cycling on and off. But the tapping continued with that same insistent rhythm that made the hair on her arms stand up. Her CB radio was silent. No other trucks on this lonely stretch of highway to ask about similar experiences. And her phone showed diminishing signal as she drove deeper into the isolated ranch country, where cell towers were sparse and civilization was measured in tens of miles between tiny towns. The tapping evolved over the next hour into something more complex, patterns that almost sounded like Morse code or some other form of communication. And she found herself listening for meaning in the rhythms, even as she told herself she was being ridiculous. The temperature gauge for the trailer showed the refrigeration was working perfectly, maintaining the required -10 degrees. But she could swear she felt warmth radiating through the cab from behind her, as if the cargo was generating heat despite being stored in what should be a frozen environment. Her GPS started acting strange around the 3rd hour, routing her onto roads that didn't match her paper map, suggesting turns that would take her away from her stated destination. And when she ignored the GPS prompts and stuck to her original route, the device started showing her position as somewhere else entirely, placing her on highways hundreds of miles from where she actually was. She received the first text message just after sunset, appearing on her phone with no sender information, just a string of numbers that she realized were coordinates, followed by a simple message: "Don't deliver." She deleted it immediately, thinking it was spam or some kind of hack. But another message arrived minutes later with more specific information. "Check the cargo. They lied about contents." Her hands tightened on the wheel because nobody should know what she was hauling or where she was going. The entire run was supposed to be confidential and off the books. But someone was clearly tracking her and knew details about her cargo that she didn't know herself. The tapping from the trailer became more insistent, almost frantic. And she could hear what sounded like voices now. Muffled and distant, but definitely human. Multiple people speaking over each other in tones that ranged from pleading to angry to terrified. The weight of the trailer started shifting during turns in ways that defied physics. The cargo seeming to move independently of the truck's momentum, sliding to one side when it should have shifted to the other, creating handling problems that made her fighting the steering wheel on every curve. More text messages arrived in rapid succession, each one more urgent. "Turn around. They're watching you. Contents are evidence. People are looking for this." And finally, one that made her blood run cold. "You're transporting proof of disappearances." She pulled over on a wide shoulder, her heart hammering, and tried to call her dispatcher, but got only a disconnected number message despite having called from this same number dozens of times before. She tried the company's main line and got a recording saying the number was no longer in service. And when she checked the contract paperwork in her folder, She found pages that now showed a company name she didn't recognize, and signatures that didn't quite match the ones she remembered signing. Another truck pulled up behind her, a black semi with no company markings, and two men in suits climbed out and approached her cab with expressions that were professionally blank but somehow threatening. They identified themselves as representatives of the shipping company and asked if she was experiencing any problems with the delivery, and when she mentioned the tapping sounds and the strange text messages, they exchanged glances that confirmed they knew exactly what was happening. One of them suggested she was overtired and perhaps experiencing auditory hallucinations from stress and isolation, offered to take the load off her hands and let her go home with her full payment, plus a bonus for the trouble. But everything about their demeanor screamed danger and deception. She told them she was fine and would complete the delivery as contracted, and they smiled in a way that didn't reach their eyes and told her that was an excellent decision, that she should proceed directly to the destination without any further stops or delays, and that it would be unfortunate if anything happened to jeopardize such a lucrative business relationship. They left, and she sat shaking in her cab, understanding now that she was caught in something much larger and more dangerous than a simple transport job, that the cargo in her trailer was important enough for people to threaten her and track her movements, and possibly worse. She made a decision that went against every practical instinct about money and bills and her daughter's future, pulled out her phone, and started filming everything. The sealed container, the warning labels, the manifest with its vague descriptions, the text messages still arriving with their warnings and coordinates. She narrated what she knew and what she suspected, creating a record of the entire situation, and sent the video files to 3 different people, including her ex-husband and her lawyer, with instructions to open them if anything happened to her. Then she made the choice that would either save her life or destroy her career, pulled forward to an access road, and started following the coordinates from the text messages instead of continuing to her assigned destination. The coordinates led her to a small-town police station in Ainsworth, and she pulled into the parking lot with her hazard lights flashing and her trailer still attached, walking into the station and telling the confused desk sergeant that she needed to report suspicious cargo and possible human trafficking or evidence tampering. The sergeant called state police, and within an hour she had 3 patrol cars and a crime scene investigation unit surrounding her truck. And when they finally opened the sealed container with proper warrants and documentation, what they found wasn't biological specimens, but boxes full of evidence from multiple cold cases. Personal belongings, clothing, photographs, items that had been reported missing, along with the people who'd vanished over a span of 15 years. The FBI was called in, and the investigation expanded rapidly, revealing a network of corrupt officials and criminals who'd been using legitimate shipping companies to move evidence of their crimes to disposal facilities where everything would be incinerated and destroyed forever. She spent 3 days giving depositions and answering questions, and the shipping company representatives who'd confronted her were arrested attempting to flee the state. Their black semi found abandoned with wiped hard drives and destroyed paperwork. The company that had hired her turned out to be a shell corporation that dissolved within hours of the investigation going public, and her contract and all related documentation were declared void, meaning she'd never be paid for the run that had nearly cost her everything. The victims' families were notified that evidence had been recovered, giving some of them their first real answers in years, and several unsolved cases were reopened based on what was found in that container. She became a protected witness for multiple trials, had to move twice because of threats, lost most of her regular contracts because other companies considered her a liability after breaking the no questions rule. But she never regretted the decision to follow those text messages and trust that something was deeply wrong with what she'd been asked to transport. The strangest part, the detail that still keeps her up at night trying to understand, is that investigators traced the text messages and found they'd been sent from phones belonging to 3 of the missing persons, phones that had been declared lost or destroyed years ago, but had somehow transmitted messages from inside her sealed trailer despite having no power source or cellular signal in a refrigerated metal container. The phones were found in the evidence boxes exactly where they should have been, completely dead with corroded batteries. But the message logs on her phone showed they'd been active and transmitting during her drive, which wasn't physically possible according to every technical expert consulted. One detective suggested that maybe the victims had found a way to reach out, to guide their evidence to someone who would actually do something about it instead of letting it disappear forever. And while that explanation violated everything rational about how technology works, it was the only one that came close to making sense of the impossible communication. She doesn't drive long haul anymore, couldn't go back to that life after everything that happened. But she stays in contact with several of the victims' families who consider her a hero for refusing to complete a delivery that would have destroyed their last chance at justice. She keeps her commercial license current, though, keeps her skills sharp, because she believes there might be other drivers in similar situations, other cargo that whispers its secrets to anyone willing to listen. And she wants to be ready to help if someone reaches out needing advice about a run that doesn't feel right. The recording she made that night has been used in multiple trials and training seminars as an example of recognizing and reporting suspicious activity. And law enforcement agencies have cited her actions as a model for how transportation professionals can help combat organized crime by trusting their instincts and asking questions even when contracts specifically prohibit them. And sometimes, late at night, she thinks about those text messages and wonders if the dead can really communicate through electronic devices. If desperation and injustice can somehow create bridges between worlds that shouldn't be able to touch, and whether her decision to listen to those impossible messages was pure luck or something else. Something that suggests the victims were still fighting for justice even after everything had been taken from them. The recovering alcoholic had been using long-haul trucking as a form of moving meditation for the past 7 years, finding peace in the endless miles and the solitary nature of the work that let him process his guilt and build something resembling redemption, one delivery at a time. At 51, he'd been sober for 9 years, had walked away from a career in corporate sales that had nearly killed him. And now he hauled agricultural equipment across the country while listening to audiobooks and tracking his progress with obsessive precision as a way of maintaining control over the chaos that had once ruled his life. Tonight, he was running Route 412 through the Oklahoma Panhandle from Boise City to Guymon, a stretch of highway so flat and straight that it seemed to extend infinitely into the horizon. The kind of road that made drivers drowsy from the sheer monotony of unchanging landscape. It was May, and sunset was painting everything in shades of gold and orange, that perpetual twilight that seemed to last forever in the Panhandle. And he'd been watching the sun hovering at the same position in the sky for what felt like hours, without it actually dipping below the horizon. He was meticulous about tracking his mileage and fuel consumption, habits left over from his drinking days when he'd needed concrete data to prove he was where he claimed to be when clients questioned his reliability. And after 2 hours of driving, he noticed something that made him check his gauges twice to confirm he wasn't misreading them. His odometer showed he'd traveled 180 miles since leaving Boise City, a perfectly normal distance for 2 hours of highway driving. But his GPS insisted he'd only moved 40 miles from his starting point, placing him still close to the Colorado border when he should have been well into Oklahoma. He pulled over to check his equipment, thinking the GPS had malfunctioned. But all the systems showed green and functional, and when he checked his fuel consumption, it matched the 180 miles his odometer showed. Meaning he'd definitely been driving for 2 hours at highway speeds, but somehow hadn't covered the corresponding distance. He continued driving, watching both systems carefully now, and realized the sun hadn't moved at all, was still hanging at that same golden angle, despite nearly 3 hours having passed since what should have been sunset. The landscape looked identical in every direction. The same flat fields of wheat stubble, the same scattered oil wells, the same distant farmhouses that never seemed to get closer, no matter how long he drove toward them. He passed an abandoned barn with a distinctive collapsed roof, noted it in his logbook, and kept driving. But 20 minutes later, the same barn appeared on his right side again. Exactly the same angle and distance from the road. He stopped and got out with his camera, photographing the barn and the surrounding landmarks to prove he wasn't imagining things, and then continued driving with growing unease as the same landmarks began appearing repeatedly in a pattern that suggested he was traveling in a loop, despite the road being perfectly straight. His CB radio crackled to life, with a voice describing an experience that sounded terrifyingly similar to his own. A trucker from years ago talking about being trapped on Route 412, about driving for days without reaching his destination, about the sun never setting and the fuel never running out, despite hours of driving. The driver tried to respond but got only static, and when he checked the CB frequency, he realized he was listening to channel 19, but the transmission quality suggested it was coming from far away, or perhaps recorded decades ago based on the slang and references the voice was using. His phone showed no service despite having had a weak signal at his last stop, and his clock showed 8:47 p.m., but the light outside suggested it was still around 6:30, that same golden hour that refused to progress into actual darkness. He tried calling his sponsor using the truck's satellite phone, needing to talk to someone who understood the importance of staying grounded and rational during crisis situations. But the call wouldn't connect, showing an error message about being outside service range despite satellite phones working anywhere on the planet. The other voice on the CB was describing the same phenomenon, talking about how the highway seemed to stretch infinitely, how the same landmarks repeated, how time itself seemed broken. And the driver recognized in that voice the same kind of desperation he'd felt during his worst days of drinking, when reality had stopped making sense and he couldn't trust his own perceptions. He made a conscious decision to treat this like sobriety, to take it 1 mile at a time, to focus on what he could control and accept what he couldn't. And he started documenting everything in his logbook with timestamps and odometer readings and descriptions of landmarks. The fuel gauge was the most disturbing anomaly because it never dropped below half a tank no matter how long he drove, as if the truck was somehow returning fuel to itself or time was resetting in ways that affected his equipment but not his memory. He checked his cargo weight on the electronic scale display and found it increasing with each check, his load of agricultural equipment somehow getting heavier despite being sealed and secured. The numbers climbing from 40,000 pounds to $45,000 to 50,000 in increments that violated basic physics. The timestamps on his phone didn't match his truck's clock, didn't match his wristwatch, each device showing different times as if they were running at different rates. And he understood that he'd somehow driven into a place where the normal rules about time and distance had stopped applying. He saw something ahead that made him hit the brakes hard enough to make his cargo shift. A figure standing on the shoulder with its thumbs out. And as he got closer, he recognized himself. Recognized the jacket he was wearing and the way he stood. And he understood with sickening certainty that he was seeing his own future. Seeing himself still trapped on this highway, trying to flag down help that would never come. The figure watched him pass with hollow eyes, and in his rearview mirror, he saw it turn to watch his taillights. And he knew that if he didn't find a way out, he would eventually become that figure, would become the ghost trapped on this endless road, trying to warn other versions of himself. The CB voice was describing the same thing now, talking about seeing himself repeatedly, about understanding that the highway was a loop in time as well as space, and the driver realized he was listening to his own future voice, broadcasting backward through time to warn his present self about what was coming. He thought about the accident then, the fatal DUI crash that had driven him to sobriety, the pedestrian he'd killed because he'd been too drunk to see the crosswalk and too proud to call a cab. He'd served time and made restitution and dedicated his life to making amends. But he'd never truly forgiven himself, had carried that guilt like cargo he couldn't deliver. And he understood suddenly that this highway was making him confront what he'd been running from for 9 years. The figure ahead of him wasn't just himself. It was the person he'd killed, standing on the shoulder the same way they'd been standing in that crosswalk, thumb out, asking for help he'd been too impaired to provide. He stopped the truck right there in the middle of the highway. No other vehicles in sight. And he got out and walked back along the road for exactly 1 mile, counting his steps and speaking his apology aloud to the empty landscape. He confessed everything he'd never said in court or therapy or the countless AA meetings where he'd told a sanitized version that left out the worst parts. He described how he'd known he was too drunk to drive, but had convinced himself he could make it. How he'd seen the figure in his headlights and swerved too late. How he'd sat in his car for 30 seconds considering whether to flee before finally calling 911. He talked about the years since, about rebuilding a life on the foundation of that death, about whether anything he'd done since was enough to balance those scales, or if he'd spend the rest of his life owing a debt that could never be repaid. When he reached exactly 1 mile according to his count, he turned around and walked back to his truck. And the sunset finally progressed, the sun dropping below the horizon in fast motion, like someone had released a paused video, and darkness fell normally across the landscape. His truck started normally, and when he checked his GPS, it showed him at the correct position on Route 412. And his next mile marker was 118 instead of 117. And time began advancing at its normal rate with his clock and phone and watch all synchronized again. He made the delivery to Gaimon without further incident, arriving almost on schedule despite believing he'd been trapped for hours, and his dispatcher commented that his timing was perfect and asked why he'd reported potential delays. He checked his logbook and found entries describing the loop and the repetitions and the confession he'd spoken to the empty highway. But the timestamps showed he'd only been driving for 4 hours total, suggesting the entire experience had happened in some compressed time frame that existed outside normal duration. He attended an AA meeting in Gaimon that night and shared the experience, not expecting anyone to believe him, but needing to speak the truth aloud as part of his program. And an old-timer approached him afterward and asked if he'd been driving Route 412 through the Panhandle. The man showed him a coin, an AA chip from the 80s, and explained that he'd had the same experience 30 years ago on the same highway, had been trapped in a loop until he'd stopped and confronted something he'd been running from, and he'd been sober ever since that night. He said the highway was known among certain circles of recovering addicts as a place where you couldn't run anymore, where the past caught up and made you stand still until you dealt with it. And every driver who experienced it and broke free never relapsed afterward because they'd finally stopped fleeing long enough to face themselves. The driver still runs Route 412 occasionally, makes that same trip from Boise City to Gaimon, and the sunset always lasts exactly as long as it should now. And his GPS matches his odometer and time flows normally. But sometimes he sees figures on the shoulder and he always stops now. Offers them rides or water or just conversation, because he understands that some people are still trapped in their loops, still driving infinitely through guilt or regret or grief. And sometimes the only way out is when someone else acknowledges you're there and offers a moment of human connection that breaks the isolation. He carries extra copies of his AA chip in the truck, gives them to drivers who seem lost or confused, and tells them about the highway that forced him to stop running. And several of them have contacted him later to say they understood what he meant. That they'd been trapped too until they found the courage to stop and speak aloud the things they'd been fleeing. And late at night when he can't sleep, he thinks about time and redemption and whether highways can become conscious enough to trap souls until they learn whatever lesson they need to learn. And whether his confession to that empty landscape was heard by something real. Or if speaking the truth aloud was itself the magic that freed him from driving forever through a sunset that never ended. The former military driver had been hauling freight across the Canadian border for 8 years, and his training in the armed forces had taught him to observe carefully and report accurately, to trust what he saw and not to embellish or speculate beyond the facts. At 33, he'd developed a reputation as a reliable cross-border hauler who kept his paperwork clean and his deliveries on time. Moving electronics and computer equipment between manufacturing facilities in the United States and distribution centers across Canada. Tonight, he was running the Trans-Canada Highway through Saskatchewan from Swift Current to Moose Jaw, a stretch of elevated roadway that cut across frozen farmland so flat and featureless it looked like driving across another planet. It was January, and the temperature had dropped to -35. The kind of cold that made metal brittle and diesel gel. And the night was absolutely clear, with the aurora borealis dancing overhead in ribbons of green and purple that cast everything in an otherworldly glow. He first noticed the lights in his rearview mirror about 20 miles east of Swift Current, a pair of headlights that appeared suddenly as if another truck had materialized directly behind him on the empty highway. He watched them for several minutes, noting that they maintained exactly the same distance regardless of his speed, matching his acceleration and deceleration with precision that seemed unusual, but not impossible. His military training had made him observant about vehicles following him, a habit left over from convoy operations where spacing and formation mattered for safety. So he varied his speed deliberately to see how the lights would respond. When he slowed to 50 miles per hour, the lights slowed identically, and when he accelerated back to 70, they matched him perfectly, never gaining or falling back even slightly, maintaining what looked like exactly a quarter mile of separation. He tried to let them pass by, slowing to 40 and pulling partially onto the shoulder, but the lights slowed proportionally and remained at that fixed distance. And when he accelerated back to highway speed, they matched him again immediately, with no lag time at all. The CB radio was silent, no chatter from other drivers, and when he tried to hail the vehicle behind him, he got no response, just dead air like nobody was listening. The lights were too bright to be normal headlights, too white and intense, and they cast strange shadows inside his cab that moved independently of his own movements, shadows that seemed to twist and elongate in ways that violated normal physics. He tried his phone to call dispatch, but found he had no service despite having had full bars just minutes before, and his GPS started showing interference, the screen flickering and occasionally placing him on completely different highways, hundreds of miles from his actual position. After an hour of this, the two lights suddenly split into 4, then 6, then 8, multiplying in pairs and spreading out to flank his truck on both sides. Moving off the highway and across the frozen farmland with no visible vehicles beneath them, just points of brilliant white light maintaining perfect formation. They moved in synchronized patterns, creating geometric shapes in the air around his truck. And he understood that whatever these were, they weren't following vehicles. weren't anything that could be explained by conventional understanding of headlights or traffic. His hands were steady on the wheel despite the fear creeping up his spine, his military training keeping him focused on maintaining control and gathering information, treating this like a reconnaissance mission, where his job was to observe and survive and report back with accurate details. The lights began responding to his actions instantaneously, not with the slight delay you'd expect from a driver reacting to what they saw ahead, but simultaneously, as if they knew what he was going to do the exact moment he decided to do it. When he thought about changing lanes, they shifted position before he moved the wheel. And when he considered braking, they adjusted their spacing before his foot touched the pedal. And he realized they weren't following his truck, but somehow reading his intentions directly. The CB radio erupted with static that resolved into a humming sound, a deep vibration that he could feel in his chest and teeth. And his compass started spinning wildly, the needle rotating continuously like it couldn't find magnetic north. The temperature gauge inside his cab began climbing despite the heater being set to normal. And he could taste metal in his mouth, a metallic tang like touching a battery to his tongue. The lights converged ahead of him now, 8 brilliant points forming a wall across the highway, and his rational mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to do anything except continue driving toward them. But there was nowhere to turn on this elevated highway with its steep shoulders dropping into frozen ditches. He maintained his speed and drove straight toward the light formation, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel and his breathing controlled through sheer force of will. And as he entered the space where the lights hovered, everything went wrong simultaneously. His truck's electrical system died completely, every light and gauge going dark, the engine cutting out. And he coasted forward in absolute silence, with only the aurora overhead providing illumination. The lights were surrounding his entire truck now, close enough that he could see they had depth and structure, not simple points, but complex geometric shapes that rotated and pulsed. And the humming sound intensified until it was almost painful. His truck lifted slightly off the road, just an inch or two, enough that he could feel the loss of traction, the strange floating sensation of being suspended. And his stomach dropped as the entire vehicle rose higher, clearing the asphalt by what felt like several feet. He couldn't see the ground anymore, couldn't see anything except the lights and the aurora overhead. And time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, subjective seconds feeling like hours, while objective time raced forward in ways his mind couldn't process. The lights were examining his truck. He understood that somehow, moving around and beneath and through it in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. And he sat frozen in his seat, hands still gripping the wheel uselessly, while something beyond his comprehension conducted some kind of inspection or analysis. The humming changed pitch, and the lights moved away all at once, retreating in perfect formation, and his truck dropped back to the highway with a jarring impact that made his cargo shift and his teeth click together. The electrical system came back online immediately, all his gauges lighting up and the engine roaring to life as if it had never stopped. And the lights were gone, simply not there anymore, like someone had flipped a switch and turned off their existence. He sat in the sudden normalcy for several seconds, his heart pounding, his breathing ragged. And then he grabbed his phone, which now showed full service, and took photographs of the highway and the sky and his dashboard, documenting everything he could while the memory was fresh and clear. His GPS showed he'd been stationary for 3 hours, despite his subjective experience of maybe 5 minutes. And his next destination was suddenly much closer than it should have been, as if he'd traveled 100 miles during those missing hours without any memory of the journey. His cargo, which had been strapped and secured according to DOT regulations, showed signs of having been disturbed. The load shifted, and some items moved as if someone had rearranged them carefully before putting them back almost in their original positions. His phone camera showed only white glare in the photos he'd tried to take, overexposed images that revealed nothing useful. And when he tried to record a voice memo describing the experience, he found his voice wouldn't work. His throat tight and uncooperative, like the words were being prevented from forming. He made it to Moose Jaw and delivered his cargo on time according to the shipping schedule. But his logbook showed a 3-hour gap with no explanation, and his fuel consumption didn't match his GPS route, indicating he'd used far less diesel than the distance suggested he should have. He filed a report with his company describing the experience in clinical detail, using the precise language of military observation reports. And they sent him for a medical evaluation that found nothing wrong beyond elevated stress indicators and some unusual radiation exposure that couldn't be explained by normal occupational sources. The Canadian authorities investigated based on his report and found physical evidence at the location where he'd been stationary. Burn marks on the asphalt in a perfect circle, electromagnetic interference affecting nearby farms' equipment, and unusual radiation readings that were documented by multiple government agencies. Other drivers started reporting similar experiences on that same stretch of highway over the following months, describing lights that followed and surrounded their trucks, missing time periods, electrical failures, and the same metallic taste and humming sound. The area was designated as an anomaly zone by transport authorities, with warnings issued about potential equipment malfunctions. Though the official explanation focused on electromagnetic disturbances from aurora activity, rather than acknowledging the more disturbing possibility that something was actively interacting with vehicles and drivers in that region. He continued to drive cross-border routes, but never took the Saskatchewan run again, always finding alternative routes that added hours to his schedule. And his company eventually stopped asking why he refused assignments through that corridor. The strangest part, the detail that haunts him more than the lights or the missing time or the physical evidence, is what he found when he finally delivered the cargo and the receiving warehouse did their inspection. 3 items that had been on his manifest were missing entirely. Computer components worth thousands of dollars that had definitely been loaded in the United States, but were simply gone by the time he arrived in Canada. The sealed container showed no signs of being opened. The customs seals were intact, and security cameras at both ends showed his truck never stopping or being accessed during the journey. The missing items were never recovered, never explained, and when he tried to report the theft, investigators found that those specific items had no record of ever existing, no manufacturing numbers or shipping documentation beyond his manifest. Like they'd been erased from all databases after being loaded onto his truck. He keeps a radiation detector in his truck now, monitors it constantly during runs, and it has spiked exactly twice since that January night. Both times in remote areas with no visible source of radiation, and both times he immediately changed routes and reported his position to dispatch. He's connected with other drivers through online forums who've had similar experiences, and they've compared notes and found patterns. The encounters tend to happen on elevated highways through flat terrain, during clear nights when the aurora is visible, and often involve electronics cargo or sensitive equipment. Some drivers believe they're being targeted for cargo theft using technology that's beyond current human capability, while others think the lights are some kind of natural phenomenon that science hasn't explained yet. But all of them agree that the experiences are real and documented and increasingly common in certain corridors. He still drives professionally, still maintains his spotless record and his reputation for reliability. But now he carries a camera system that records continuously from multiple angles, and he's collected footage from dozens of runs, showing anomalous lights in the distance, electrical interference, and compass malfunctions that correspond with geographic locations other drivers have reported. The footage has been analyzed by investigators and researchers, and while no definitive conclusions have been reached, the evidence strongly suggests that something is operating on remote highways, something that interacts with trucks and drivers in ways that leave physical traces but resist conventional explanation. And late at night, when he's driving through empty country under clear skies, he watches his mirrors carefully and listens to his CB radio and keeps his radiation detector where he can see it, because he knows the lights are still out there, still following trucks and examining cargo and leaving drivers with missing time and unanswerable questions about what really travels the loneliest highways when the rest of the world is asleep.